let me give you a conceptual overview. The traditional costing method says, okay, our cost objects, again, are the objects that we're trying to estimate the cost of. It could be the job, it could be a product line, it could be a service, it could be a particular customer, a group of customers, it could be a department. And so traditionally what we do is we take the direct costs, those are easy to assign, only the direct product cost. And then the indirect product costs, we lump those all together, that's like the utilities, and we assign those in proportion to one cost driver. So it could be direct labor hours, right? We calculate this predetermined overhead rate and then allocate the costs in proportion to the amount of direct labor hours used. And then the selling and administrative costs are not allocated. All right, so that's a theoretical overview. Theoretically, how does activity-based costing differ? Well, it's going to start out the same. All right, we've got the same cost objects. The direct materials and direct labor costs are still easy to deal with, but here's the big difference. Boom. All right. Now, there's a few things that stand out in here. The first thing that you'll notice is that we don't have just one cost pool and one cost driver, which is direct labor hours, right? We've got 5 different cost pools now. We've basically taken all these indirect costs and divided them into 5 different cost pools, and we're going to allocate those costs in proportion to different cost drivers. So you can see engineering cost pool is going to be allocated based on the amount of design hours. Material handling cost pool will be allocated in proportion to the number of machine hours. Assembly cost pool in proportion to direct labor hours. Customer relations cost pool in proportion to the number of phone calls. And this other cost pool we're not going to allocate. Okay, so that's the biggest difference that probably stands out to you. A couple other differences that may be less obvious, but that are implied here, is that some of these indirect product costs may be assigned to this other cost pool which are not allocated. Now, for external reporting purposes, this would not be acceptable. For external reporting purposes, you have to take all of the indirect product costs and assign them to the job so they can be expensed when you sell the product. Okay, so that's one difference that is not as obvious. Another difference that is not as obvious is that some of these selling and administrative costs might be assigned to these cost pools along with product costs and allocated to the job. Well, that's also not acceptable for external reporting purposes, because generally accepted accounting principles say you cannot allocate selling and administrative costs to your product. You cannot capitalize those. You have to expense those. All right, but anyway, theoretically, this is an overview of how activity-based costing differs from traditional costing. Now, let's talk about the steps associated with activity-based costing, still at a theoretical level. There's 5 steps. The first step has 3 subcomponents. First, we want to identify all the activities. All right, so we go through and list all the different activities. You can imagine this is going to be a huge job for a large company. There could be hundreds or thousands of activities. And we don't necessarily want to use each of those activities. It'd just be too much effort, not worth the effort of trying to understand the cost of each activity. So the second subcomponent of step 1 is to group those activities into different cost pools. All right, so instead of, even though we have 9 different activities, we've only got 3 cost pools. And I'll follow up on this in just a minute to talk about how we divide up these activities into the different cost pools. All right, and then the third subcomponent for group 1 is to select an activity measure or cost driver that is appropriate for each cost pool. All right, so it might be direct labor hours for cost pool 1, it might be design hours for cost pool 2, it might be number of phone calls for cost pool 3. All right, the second step then is to take the indirect costs, and it may not necessarily just be overhead costs, but all the indirect costs, and assign those, first of all, to the different cost pools. Then, now that we have costs in the cost pools and cost drivers, and assuming we understand the total amount of the cost driver, the third step is to calculate an activity rate for each of these cost pools. And then we can take, using those rates, we can assign cost to the cost object, again, whether it's a job, a product, a customer, a group of customers, whatever segment you're talking about. And we can assign cost to the cost object in proportion to the activity rates that we had calculated in step 3. And the last step is just to recognize that we've got a lot of information here that could be very useful that we do not have from the traditional costing method. And so we want to think about how we can prepare reports that will facilitate management's decisions. Okay, so that's a theoretical overview of the 5 steps for activity-based costing. A couple of notes that I want to talk about here. The first note, like I said, pertains to how do we group activities together. Well, when you think of activities and how they behave, we had typically thought of some activities being variable activities and the costs associated with those activities being variable costs, meaning every time you make a unit of your product, you have to perform that activity, versus fixed costs, which do not change in total with regard to the amount of the activity. In the activity-based costing world, we want to keep that idea in mind, but we also want to break it down into finer components. So still, we're going to have at one end of the spectrum variable costs and activities, but we'll call these unit level activities. And at the other end of the spectrum, we'll have organization sustaining activities. Let me give you just a couple of examples here. Unit level activity might be having to sand each product that you make. All right, if you're making wooden products, maybe it's pens, maybe it's cabinets, whatever the case may be, no matter what you make, you're probably going to have to do some sanding. Organization sustaining activities, in contrast, might be rent for your facilities, whether you make 50 product lines or 2 product lines or 1,000 units or 1 unit or however many customers you have to pay rent to have your organization. Okay, for public companies, it might be filing costs with the SEC. Okay, it really doesn't correlate with anything other than being in business. All right, and now let's just kind of look at these finer distinctions in here. We might have some activities that are almost unit level activities, but not quite. So batch level activities. These are activities that you perform for each batch of units that you produce. So this might be things like machine setup activities. Okay, so you might have to go through and retool a machine so that you can make doors. So let's assume we're in a General Motors manufacturing plant and they've got these robots that bend the metal to fit different types of cars. So if you want to make doors that go on Camaros, you would calibrate the machine so that when you send the metal through, they'll bend the metal just right to fit the Camaro door. And then maybe later in the week you want to make doors for the Corvette. So you'll have to recalibrate the machine, retool it, and then once you've done that, you can run through lots of metal to make a batch of doors for Corvettes. Okay, so activities that vary with the number of batches that you perform. All right, then we've got product level activities, not to be confused with unit level activities. Product level activities correspond to the number of product lines you have, or the types of product lines you have. Okay, so like I was just talking about General Motors, you might have a Camaro, you might have a Corvette, you might have Lumina, whatever the case may be. All right, an activity that you have to perform for each product line is design. You have to design what those products are going to look like. And then you might have advertising activities and costs associated with individual product lines. All right, and then you've got customer level activities, which are correlated with the number and types of customers you have. So if you have 1,000 customers, then your order processing costs will probably be a lot higher than if you have just 1 customer. If you have customers that are nearby, then the shipping costs will probably be a lot less than customers who are very far away. All right, so customers that vary with the type and number of customers. So anyway, this is called the cost hierarchy in activity-based costing. And it's important to recognize this because this is how we will group together different activities. So once we understand this, then we'll say, okay, all these different hundreds or thousands of activities that we have, we want to group together based on how they behave. So we might have a batch or a group of unit level activities that all may be are correlated with the number of units that we make. And so we'll group all those activities together. We've got another set of activities and costs that are correlated with the number of machine setups that we have. And so we'll group all those activities and costs together. All right, and so forth. All right, now when you're doing this, you might recognize that, hey, there's still a lot of room for judgment in deciding what type of cost driver to use. And if we go back to this example here with the roommates and dividing costs up among roommates, you'll recognize that, hey, Number of showers, yeah, that's fine. But if you look at the number of minutes spent in the shower, Pat and Chris use more minutes in the shower than you do, even though you take more showers. So in other words, you take a lot of showers, but they're very quick. Pat and Chris take a few showers, but they're very long. So they are probably really consuming more of the water. So this may be a more accurate way, it probably is a much more accurate way of allocating the water cost. Okay, so number of showers is a transaction driver. This is a driver or an allocation base that keeps track of how many times you take a shower. Number of minutes spent in the shower is a duration driver. It keeps track of how long you spend doing a particular activity. All right, and so that's kind of what we have here. We've got duration drivers and transaction drivers, and there's trade-offs that you have to make. You might think, hey, why don't we just always use number of minutes spent in the shower? That's going to be more accurate. Well, yeah, it's also probably less likely that you will keep track of how long each shower is, right? How likely is it that you're going to have a stopwatch there and you'll click it as soon as you get in the shower and click it as soon as you get out? And then do that every time you take a shower? Probably not very likely. Okay, so the trade-offs here are that if you want something accurate, you're probably going to have to keep track of how long you do it. It's a duration driver. But a transaction driver, while it may not be as accurate, it's going to be a lot less costly to gather the information. All right, so anyway, again, these are notes related to coming up with these cost pools and selecting activity measures.